we're doing is examining through a case study in the paper industry the salience of the idea and analysis that surrounds the term financialization. Now, in most people's hands, the term financialization, and how many of you feel like you're up and have read up on financialization in the last 30 years? Okay, so this is like not quite a mini primer, but I'm going to give you a few basic points here. A very common way of looking at it is simply to think of it as a structural change in capitalism that's emerged since the 1980s. That basically is premised on the idea that we used to have an era of managerial capitalism with the rise of the market for shareholder governance, kind of Wall Street impinging or controlling what's going on in firms. Something else very different is happening. IR scholars have done some really good work on this. Keep your eyes out for Rose Batt and Eileen Applebaum, who many of you know, who have a book coming out very, very soon, sort of an IR take on financialization. I've read a lot of their stuff, and they, along with Andy Jacoby, who had a great piece about 5 years ago, among other things, focus on showing just how financialization has produced negative effects on employment. If you go back a little farther, it's always worth, if you haven't read their work, reading the work of anything that Tom Kochen has written in the last 30 years, because he just developed such insightful stuff, and it really charts where the field's insights have come. He and Osterman did a book called Mutual Gains Enterprise in 1994, which is at the high moment of calling for employee involvement, labor-managed cooperation, high-performance work systems as a way of improving the competitiveness of the American firm. And one of the things they make really clear in there that the single obvious obstacle to that was the VP of finance in most corporations, who were shunting aside the other managers in HR and whatnot who were interested in doing this. In my home field of radical political economy, there's also a view of this structural change, which tends to focus on some macro performance questions, especially explaining the rise of inequality, which you saw some of the data on a second ago, and also understanding the origins and character of the financial crisis of 2008. In our approach to thinking about financialization, we want to bring a big caveat, which is to be suspicious of what some have called epical thinking. That we are now in the age of finance, we have finance capitalism, and then finance capitalism somehow or another determines and defines what the epic is. Associating a particular industry with an epic of capitalism has many problems. My co-author, Rick McIntyre of URI, and I have come to this thinking in a different context, which is the historiography of the Capital Labor Report or Post-War Social Compact, in which there was a lot of thinking in IR and other places that we had an epic of industrial relations defined by sort of recognized collective bargaining, UAW style. And when you think that way, then you tend not to look underneath and see what else is there. And historians have done that and found that you can't define this as an epic because there are all kinds of things going on there that do not fit the stylized notion of the Capital Labor Report. So that's our kind of methodological suspicion of trying to think of it that way. Greta Krippner's important book, Capitalizing in Crisis, which is part of the 3 books you should read on this topic, the other 2, the ones being by Julia Ott and Louis Hyman, I think makes a similar case. She describes the dramatic increase in the place of finance in our economy, particularly focusing on share profitability. And so there's nothing to deny that there's major structural changes going on in the economy, but she wants to stop short of making a leap to calling this the epic of finance. And in our piece here, what we're doing is kind of taking that sensibility and going to the micro level. Another caveat I'm thinking about this as an era of financialization is the historical perspective, which has been alluded to by some of the previous speakers. Basically, you can go back to the 19th century with Karl Marx, the early 20th century with Tawney or Burley and Means, and find that they were concerned about the rise of finance at these earlier points in history. Writing in the 19th century, Marx noted in part just how attractive finance or merchant capitalism was because it got rid of the dirty work of having to get involved in production. You make profits just using your capital, getting it right back. That's a much better way of doing things. Marx has a great quote, which if I had more time I would share with you about basically how the joint stock company opens up a whole avenue for speculators, swindlers, cheating of all kinds, parasites and whatnot. So just to summarize, we want to see in our case study the idea that the relationship between industrial and financial capital is one that's contingent, complex, and constituted in part by the very narratives that try to define it. We find particularly relevant to our study the idea of performativity in finance. Sociologists and management theorists in particular have argued that the main effect of financial innovation is performative. In other words, theories that describe firms as bundles of decomposable assets that should be subject to the sole goal of maximizing shareholder wealth, that theory, performativity means that firms increasingly act as if that's in fact what they are. Performativity theorists argue that this emerged in the 1970s when the rapid saturation of Black-Scholes options theory for derivatives and things like that, and Jensen and Menkling's famous article, very widely read, on principal agent problem, that the rise of these theories and the diffusion of them began to create economic and behavior institutions first depicted in those theories. Now, the most important idea to come from Jensen and Meckling, which many of you know, is that the firm is not an enterprise. It's not an ongoing institution that needs to be preserved and cherished and built and whatever. It's simply a nexus of contracts and assets, decomposable, and the owners have no moral obligation to any goals other than shareholder value maximization. Morality and efficiency indeed is served when shareholders and their representatives act in the market of corporate governance. And to put it kind of bluntly, there's no problem in our economy that a good, well-executed hostile takeover can't fix. So the focus of our narrative, in our focus on narrative, we agree with other important writers on this subject, Lazonick and O'Sullivan, who declare that shareholderism, more than anything else, is an ideology of corporate governance. And that shareholderism, which is the term that we'll use for financialization, is a movement within capitalist elites rather than an epochal shift in capitalism itself. Of course, these theories are ideologies, and no ideologies go untested. So if we're thinking of shareholderism as a script that we're trying to get people, or these folks trying to get people to perform, what determines whether or not the script in fact gets performed? In our case study, the paper industry, shareholderism was confronted by the other ruling management theory of stakeholderism, building up all the stakeholders, investing in your employees, R&D for the long run, all that stuff. And they're also confronted by a workers' ideology that was grounded in a particular form of welfare capitalism. And so we're saying that in this case, Scott, or Sun and Scott, asserting shareholder rights so forcefully, the Jensenite approach to the world may have also unintentionally revived the debate over whose interest should matter in enterprise governance. In particular, we are struck by the revival of arguments against the assumption that's at the heart of Jensen Meckling that passive owners should be the residual claimant of the firm's surplus, arguments that challenge both the efficiency and justice claims made by shareholderism's proponents. Now, our case study looks at Scott paper between 85 and 95, looking at the corporate level and then also going down to the level of this one particular mill. The mill's called S.T. Warren. It's Westbrook. I live in Portland, Maine. It's the next town over. I've been doing an interview project there and at other paper mills in the state. I'm sort of finishing up a book, and this paper is kind of a piece of it. Look for it, if I get to use the title, The Rise and Fall of the Paper Plantation. Okay, so just a little bit of background on S.T. Warren and on Scott. A couple things to say about S.T. Warren, 150-year-old paper mill. There's still some of its operations going as we speak. It moved into the market for glossy-coated publication paper, dominated the Northeast market really for over a century. At the heart of its operation, they built a really excellent R&D center in the 1920s. And as I described in the paper, what goes on in that company, the ability to come up with new products, constantly fine-tuning quality looks a lot like what Peoria and Sable would have described as flexible specialization, but this has been going on almost for a century at this firm. At the same time, it has a really interesting labor relations history. There was a paternalistic corporate welfareism that went back to the founder, Samuel Dennis Warren, and lasted until very late unionization in the 1960s. In its most modern labor relations history, it became what I would call, if you know Jacoby's work, a failed modern manner. And out of it came extremely militant union locals that were aggressive on all traditional workplace contractualism matters, quick to strike, and so forth. And then there's some developments in the 1980s and 1990s in the main paper industry as a whole, where workers get increasingly radicalized around issues of corporate dominance and corporate greed. Turning to Scott at the larger level, in going back to look at Scott in this period, there's a kind of interesting phenomenon. In the mid-1990s, Scott was taken over by Al Chainlaw Dunlap. How many of you remember all about Al Dunlap? So he comes in, and actually he was heralded by the Harvard Business School as the leading example of Jensenite financial engineering. Al Dunlap comes in 18 months and squeezes all kinds of assets, lays off thousands of employees, improves margins, and then sells the company into two pieces. And in 18 months, he earned a net $6.3 billion for its shareholders, and in the process, if you follow the story, destroying a lot of both companies along the way. So there it is as an archetype of extreme financial engineering. But in the 9 years before that, they had a stakeholder project. You know, the grooviest thing that would come out of something that Peter Senge or Tom Kochen would design. And what we're depicting, having a really detailed look, especially at the mill, but a little bit in the corporate boardroom, is that neither narrative was dominant, neither practices were dominant. They competed and contradicted with each other, and as we've suggested, they provoked an even third narrative in politics about ownership and management of the firm that came from the workers. I didn't put this on PowerPoint, so I hope my dramatic acting works here. I had a fascinating interview about 10 years ago with a fellow who was the senior vice president in charge of strategic planning, essentially. And he was the one who led this stakeholder initiative, which expanded into a high-performance work system labor management cooperation project a few years later. And he talks about the arrival of a cipher for Jensen in the corporate boardroom or corporate CEO suite in the late 1890s. So here's the 1990s. Here's the quote. "I could see it coming, and that's one of the reasons I got out when I did. They used to have a president's meeting, which was all the top people of Scott. It was 1989. If you look back to the mid-1980s, when we were implementing our new corporate strategy, we made some pretty good progress. The business improved dramatically. And the focus of the meeting all of a sudden shifted from being, we're no longer interested in being just a good company, we want to be an outstanding company," or something like that. And so the whole focus at that meeting was, how are we going to raise our margins up or returns up from a return on investment of 8 to 10% to 14%, so that we could, quoting the VP finance president, we could become a preeminent company. And the guy says, the stakeholder guy says, in our industry, there isn't anybody who's preeminent in the first place. And the way they approached it, our vice president of finance got up and basically said, all we have to do is increase our margins to a couple of percent and reduce our turnover, assets to sales, by about 10% or 20%, and the numbers work out. And so that's all you got to do. So there's another paragraph here where the guy just completely trashes the idea based on the premise that the VP of Finance has no idea how you could, go about managing an enterprise and improving its profitability. The end of the story is this again, the vice president. I went to some finance people that I knew in treasury and corporate planning who were staff to the corporate vice president of finance. And I said, these numbers don't add up. They don't make any sense at all. And the staff says, well, that's what we told the guy. the guy who was going to make the speech. We told him that those numbers weren't reasonable, weren't accurate, and were impractical. And he, the vice president of the finance, said to the staff, I'm trying to make a point. These guys aren't smart enough to understand it anyway. So that's the arrival of this narrative in the boardroom. I say some things about the CEO sort of, I think, buffeted internally and externally about which way to go because the stakeholder approach was producing results, but it wasn't fast enough and Wall Street was giving him a lot of heat. And throw a recession in there and make things worse. According to this vice president, the CEO Lippincott kind of pushed off the financialized narrative in strategy for a couple of years, but then began to succumb to it. All right, down on the reservation in Westbrook, Maine, you have a true mismatch. First of all, the mill was put up for sale in 1991. New outside managers came in, mainly pushing the financial narrative. More on this in a moment. At the same time, the VP for Human Resources was coming in and producing these stakeholder cooperation work reorganization projects. For our purposes, the language delivered to the workers at the mill by the new mill management is of great interest. Right after they put the mill up for sale, they take all of the workers down to a local venue where they hold like high school basketball championships. They put 2,000 people in a room, and the new mill manager gets up and declares, all assets are under review. And over the coming months, it was made clear to the workers in the union that the various operations in the mill were being treated as decomposable assets to be evaluated, improved, sold, or shut down. And then somewhat oddly, the workers were enlisted in labor management cooperation projects to implement this financialized strategy. And all kinds of stuff goes on that I described in the paper, and it wasn't all good. Finally, I want to turn to how the workers reacted and resisted to this new narrative. First of all, they understood their mill as a flagship. It was the largest producer in their dominant product segments in 1991 in the country still. They had their potent R&D operation, which in fact had just patented these new things that they produced. It'll take me a long time to describe, but they patented them, held the patents for 17 years, and they could make 3 times as much money per roll off these new things that they patented than you could off regular specialty paper. And that's why the mill is still open, because that part of the mill is still producing. Interestingly, Wall Street analysts, when the workers, as I'm going to get to in a moment, announced that they were interested in buying the mill, Wall Street analysts said that it was a strong plant that would recover as soon as the business cycle recovered. And then when they contracted their own consultants, they confirmed as much as that was the case. So basically, the local mill was seen as a viable enterprise for the future. There's a bunch of stuff in there where I elaborate the idea that Local 1016 is part of a movement, political culture amongst paper workers in Maine. Had adopted a kind of definite anti-corporate outlook and culture and language. And right before this all happens at SD Westbrook, the biggest paper operation in Maine in Millinocket and East Millinocket, Great Northern Paper, was purchased in a hostile leveraged buyout by Georgia Pacific, and the word was getting around what that means in their place. So the workers sought to buy the mill. In fact, what happened was I was a young whippersnapper back then. They knew I was a sympathetic person. They called me down to a meeting, and they asked me, how could we buy this mill? And they've done a lot of research themselves on their operations, and I said, oh goodness, I call ICA in Cambridge. Maybe some people actually know how to do it. Another thing that I dwell on in the paper is that their thinking was really shaped by this strong memory of Mother Warren, when it was owned back in the Warren days. And I explained a variety of ways that their interpretation of the mill's decline as being caused by changes in corporate governance was understood through the lens of what had come before. And as I elaborated, there's a lot of specifics to this, but the bottom line is that in remembering Mother Warren, they were celebrating at least a different kind of capitalism, right? At least a Chandlerian ethos kind of capitalism. But I also ask the question, is it capitalist at all? They hailed the class justice of their former owners because the owners regularly gave back lots of their profits to the community in the form of very generous public works. There was a kind of job security that was just unlike anything that you would recognize in most capitalist economies, and they were quite aware that they had a different kind of level of economic security, not exposed to the labor market at all, that was not shared elsewhere. And there was a very strong sense that there was an ethical economic community. And we go on to say that I think we call this enterprise consciousness. And so to conclude, we try and highlight two different things, which is the competition of these narratives that reflect, I think, a conflict amongst different parts of the capitalist elite as it exists in and associated with this paper industry. That the resistance on the part of the workers, and very much some of the local managers as well, was that they wanted to continue to think of this as an enterprise, not as a bundle of decomposable assets, and to pursue strategies that might help them keep it as an enterprise. I finished with a little epilogue, which I'd love to talk about in the discussion. All right, this is the part where somebody was supposed to say 2 minutes over, but this is my conclusion. We see the kind of enterprise consciousness that developed here, and I'm in the middle of doing research on this similar kinds of stories in the rest of the main paper industry, where I have sort of secondhand knowledge that there's a lot of this going on throughout the state. That we see it potentially relevant to a growing movement with very strong interest from the left in supporting worker cooperatives in similar economic institutions, right? Not the kind of investors' democracy that Julia Ott writes about, but the kind of democracy everybody holds up Mondragon as the wonderful paragon of. I would put it this way in a larger context. I think we're in a point in time where we have to find every lever to pursue progressive change, return of industrial democracy, which is a language I think we should revive. And we need to look wherever we might be able to find ways of cultivating sensibilities that may lead in that direction. And I just make this point, which is worth discussing, or maybe not, which is that worker ownership is not a panacea, but it could be one of many levers that could go together. And I think, I always have my students read stuff on Mondragon, and they're always struck by the idea that you can mix ethics and economics. So I hope that that's where this case study we did here leads in terms of conversation. So I'll finish there.